Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was born to Randall and Ellen Fish in 1870. His father was 43 years older than his mother and 75 years old at the time of his birth. He was the youngest of three and wished to be called Albert after a sibling had passed away in an attempt to distance himself from the nicknames that he'd picked up as a child. His family had a history of mental illness, mania, hallucinations, all manner of afflictions. In 1875, Albert's father died of a heart attack, and he was placed into an orphanage by his mother. Here he underwent massive amounts of physical abuse, but began to realize that he was able to enjoy the pain that came with it. By 1880, Albert's mother had secured a job and was able to take Albert back from the orphanage. By the time Albert was 12, he began a relationship with a telegraph boy who introduced him to urolognia, drinking urine, and coprophagia, eating feces. Around this time, Albert began to visit public bathhouses in order to watch other boys in various states of undress. He also began to write letters to women with fake names, oftentimes vulgar in nature. By the time Albert was 20, he had moved to New York City and become a prostitute. This was around the same time that he began to molest young boys. 8 years later, his mother had arranged a marriage for him to a younger woman, with whom he had 6 children. Once married, he began work as a painter to support his family. His sexual appetite did not change, however, and he continued to molest young boys, most younger than the age of 6. His interest started taking an even more macabre turn when he visited a museum which had a bisection of a penis on display. This heightened his interest in mutilation. Soon after, he was convicted of grand larceny and was incarcerated in Sing Sing. After his incarceration, he met a 19-year-old named Thomas Kedden, with whom he began a sadomasochistic relationship. With Fish's confession, it became clear that Kedden suffered from some sort of mental disability. After he knew Kedden for 10 days, he took him to a secluded farmhouse and began to torture him. He continued to torture him over a 2-week period, ending with Fish cutting off half of Kedden's penis.
I shall never forget the scream or the look he gave me.
He originally intended to cut him up, but was afraid attention would be drawn to him. Instead, he poured peroxide on his wounds, bandaged him up, and left him with a $10 bill. He never attempted to find out what happened to Kedden. In 1917, Fish's wife left him for another man, leaving him to care for his 6 children alone. Soon after, he began to have auditory hallucinations, leading him to wrap himself in a carpet because he believed that he was told to do so by John the Apostle. Around this time, Albert began to indulge in self-harm, lodging needles into his pelvis. While he never claimed to have abused his own children, he did admit to having them beat his ass with a nail-studded paddle that he often used to abuse himself. He then became obsessed with cannibalism and often fed his children meals of raw meat. By 1919, his crimes escalated further. He began selecting victims who were white or disabled, believing these would not be missed or reported lost. He tortured and mutilated children using 3 weapons of choice: a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a saw. In July of 1924, Fish came across an 8-year-old girl playing on her family's farm. He offered her money in exchange for help finding rhubarb, but he was chased away by her family. Later, he slept in their barn and was discovered by her father and forced to leave. Around this time period, Albert began to suffer from psychosis, granting him the belief that God wanted him to torture and mutilate children. Shortly before his abduction of Grace Budd, he attempted to test his implements of hell on a child he had been molesting named Cyril Quinn. He asked him and a friend inside for lunch. He asked him and a friend inside for lunch. The children spotted the knife, saw, and cleaver. They became afraid and fled the house. Albert remarried on February 6, 1930 to Estella Wilcox, but divorced after only 1 week. He was arrested soon after for sending an obscene and vulgar letter to a woman who had posted an advertisement as a maid. He then was sent to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital. In May of 1928, Albert read an advertisement in the paper for a man who was seeking a job. He went to meet with the man, Edward Budd, at his apartment. He presented himself to his family as Frank Howard, a farmer from New York. He promised him work and said that he could contact him within a few days. After no contact was sent, he apologized and met with the family one more time. This is when he came to meet Grace Budd. Upon seeing her, he fabricated a story that he had to go to a niece's birthday party and invited Grace along with him, convincing her parents that she would be safe in his hands. Grace never returned to her home. Arrests were made, but none of the arrests were Albert Fish. In November of 1934, Grace's mother received a letter in the mail. The letter read as follows.
My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he had 2 others and went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At the time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep the others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out, and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and is sold as veal cutlet, bought the highest price. John stayed there so long, he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, and burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy, because he had the fattest ass, and of course, the most meat upon it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next. He went the same way. At that time I was living at 409 East 100th Street, rear, right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I was up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs, stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called to her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw my naked body, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First I stripped her naked. How she did kick bite and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her though. I could have had I wished. She died a virgin.
The letter was investigated by the police and was found to line up as it pertained to the kidnapping and the events, but it was impossible to determine if Fish had actually consumed the girl's body. The letter was delivered to Grace Budd's mother, emblazoned with an emblem of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. This just happened to be left behind in a room that Fish was staying in briefly before the letter was received. Police waited for him to return to this room and took him into custody, where he admitted that he originally planned to kill Edward Budd, not Grace. He stated that it never entered his head to rape her, but then admitted to having 2 involuntary ejaculations while he was strangling her to death. Oh my god. This led charges against him to be sexually motivated, and struck any charges regarding the cannibalism that was claimed. After his arrest, other crimes began to come to light. One crime in particular was the death of Billy Gaffney, a 4-year-old boy whom, while playing with friends, was abducted by Fish and never recovered. Albert wrote the following about this encounter.
I brought him to Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked, tied his hands, feet, gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I found at the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took the trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat of 9 tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves into 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks, gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears, and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below the belly button. Then through his legs, about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, legs below the knee. This I put in sacks weighed with stones, tied the ends and threw them into pools of slimy water you see along the road going to North Beach. Water is 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body, this part I liked the best, his monkey and peewees, and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face, belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when meat had roasted about 1/4 of an hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy. This I mixed with onions. At frequent intervals I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so that the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet fat little behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was sweet as a nut, but his peewees I could not chew. Threw them in the toilet.
Albert's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began in early March of 1935. Several psychiatrists attested to Fish's perverse fetishes, including but not limited to sadism, masochism, exhibitionism, piquerism, cannibalism, pedophilia, urophilia, coprophagia, infibulation. The state of New York stated that they had never encountered someone who had so many psychiatric phenomena, and there was no one in medical record that had so many abnormalities. After a time-consuming trial, Fish was found to be sane and guilty and was ordered to death via the electric chair. He was pronounced dead after 3 minutes in the electric chair at Sing Sing. His last words were,
"I don't even know why I'm here."